Howdy guys, Jimmy Song here for Off Chain. I have a very good friend of mine and a special guest here with me today. He's someone I've known for like 20 years. We used to work at a couple of different companies together. We've gone through a lot. It's kind of crazy that I'm introducing him as a well-renowned, world-renowned, award-winning science fiction author. But that's to me, he's just Ken, whom I've known for a long time. But he and I have both come a long ways. Ken, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me, Jimmy.
Yeah, I mean, let's start off with how we met and all that stuff. I still remember 1998 was the year I graduated from college, and I remember driving like 18 hours with all of my stuff in my tiny Corolla, and I arrived at what was both the office and where I was staying for an entire week, which was that apartment on Western Avenue in Cambridge. I came up and you were the first person to answer the door. So you were literally the first person that I met in Boston. So do you remember all that? What's it been like since then?
Oh my God, that apartment. I mean, do you remember the apartment, all the pasta we used to make every single day?
Yeah, I think I subsisted in an entire month on just pasta and sauce because I wanted to save money.
I know, and yeah. I couldn't believe it. And I remember, at the time, I was staying in this apartment that was a few blocks away, and I was trying to save money. So I had no bed. I had a mattress that I think we picked up off the street, and that was like the only furniture in my room.
Oh, don't forget the beanbag at the office that we also picked up off the street and tried to clean. Yeah.
Well, those were some. I mean, we did have some issues with those hygiene habits. We had mice. Do you remember the mice?
Yeah, I do remember the mice. That was really gross. And only a startup that's really desperate could get through something like that. But yeah.
Wow. So, I mean, I've had a very bizarre and strange career. I started off after college working for Microsoft. And then after, I think only a little bit of that, I said, no, this is the time for everyone to go do their startup thing. So I joined the startup, the same company that you were at.
As a coder, I might add. And
that's right.
And you guys might not know because he's a writer and all that, but Ken's one of the best coders I've ever worked with, which is saying something because I've worked with a lot of coders.
That was very cool. So I was a coder, and we did that together for. Do you remember how many years we were?
It was like it ended in 2001, so it's like 2 or 3 somewhere around
2 or 3 years, yeah. And then after that, I decided to go to law school, and I became a corporate lawyer actually for a number of years. And
this was your phase of working for the man.
Yes. And at the end of that, I decided to, have a change in my life because we had young kids, and I really wanted to spend more time with kids. And that was when we got to work together again because you introduced me to work for a litigation consulting company. So I ended up as a litigation consultant where I got to both look at source code and write arguments for judges. So that was a lot of fun. And then starting about a year ago, I decided to go full-time as a writer. So that's what's been happening with me.
Yeah, and you've written a lot of stuff. I mean, just you have an entire book of just short stories. You've published, a couple of very long books. That's like Game of Thrones. Like I finished the first one. I haven't started on the second. Same thing with the book that you translated. Three Body Problem.
That's right.
Books 1 and 3 are what you've translated. I read the first one. Just haven't had the time for number 2 and number 3. So I mean. Like that's been quite a career for you. Like how did you get into like translating that in the first place?
You know, I got into the whole translation thing really just by accident. I had a friend, a writer, a science fiction writer from China, who also, you know, works in the tech industry, and I loved his work so much that I said, you know, one time he showed me a translation of his story into English, and it was done by a professional translation company, but it wasn't very good. And I said, you know, do you mind if I just try to tweak it? And it turns out that as all of us coders know, it's much more fun to write new code than to fix old code. So it was much more fun for me to do the translation from scratch than to fix someone else's bad translation. So I just, you know, decided to do it from scratch, and that translation ended up winning an award, and it was one of the first translations published in really that I'm aware of that's got published in a big commercial sci-fi magazine from China within the last decade or so. And so that's kind of how it started. I mean, I was just trying to promote my friend's work, and I got to know more people whose work I enjoyed, and I was like, well, you know, it would be fun to bring them more fans and to just introduce people to the sort of science fiction being written in China, because a lot of it is very cool, and none of it is being was being read here. And then eventually I got enough of a reputation that when they were trying to find a translator for the three-body problem, they came to me. So that's how that happened.
Yeah, and like that's, I think you know, the science fiction fans you know, in America and, you know, the English speaking world owe you a debt, because I mean that book, when I read it, it was just so interesting how you know, it was like hard sci-fi, but from a completely different point of view, and it almost felt like you were looking at like two alien civilizations almost, because it was like China is like one kind of alien, you know, like very different mental mindset and all that stuff, and then you got the aliens, and yeah, I don't know, I feel like that's what a lot of technical people end up doing, is translating from one side to another. And so yeah, I don't know.
I mean, if you think about it, it's sort of like, you know, if you're a techie and you're really into the whole tech stuff, when you try to read a book in a genre that you don't really read much, you know, that's kind of like the experience you get. If you try to read you know, some modern romances, it's actually very cool as a coder, because you're going in there to learn a whole new system, you know, a whole new system of signals and how things work and how symbols are understood and what the rules are. It's a lot of fun, and I think it's, you know, the same sort of thing. A lot of the pleasure from reading sci-fi is to understand constructed systems, but I think if you try to reading any genre that you're not familiar with, you end up experiencing a little bit of that too, just because you get to see how other social symbolic systems work. It's very cool.
Not unlike learning a new computer language.
It is exactly like that. Yep. Yeah,
and I know you're a big fan of Lisp, and you know, we could talk about that a little bit. We could. Well, anyway, all right. So let's get into the topic that I really want to talk about. This is Ken's story is in this anthology here, 12 Tomorrows, published by MIT Technology Review, and the story that you have in here, it's called Byzantine Empathy, and despite having reviewed it like 8 months ago, I finally understood the title yesterday. First of all, the story is at the intersection of a lot of your interests. And it's interesting that the hypothetical cryptocurrency Empathium plays such a big role in it. Like what inspired you to write this story?
Okay, well, I mean, you know, the really short version of it is I was tired and I needed a break. That's what happened. I mean, I've been working on my epic fantasy series, you know, The Grace of Kings and Wall of Storms, and the third book I'm working on. I've been working on the series now for 8 years, and it's soon going to be 9.
Oh my God, has it been that long?
I know, it's insane. But when you work on something for that long and you're immersed in the world, you tend to go a little, I don't know, I get a little crazy, you know, because day in, day out, you're thinking about this one story. And so when I got the chance from the MIT Tech Review they invited me to contribute something to their hard sci-fi anthology. The Tech Review does one of these every year, and they invite authors to contribute to it. To write a story based on some topic that has been extensively covered in the Tech Review. And I was like, oh, this would be a lot of fun because, you know, having done the epic fantasy for so long, any chance to actually do something that's much more hardcore techie is a lot of fun for me. Not that my epic fantasy is actually not, you know, my epic fantasy is one of those books in which the magic is really engineering. So I do a lot of geeky, nerdy engineering stuff in there, but it's not quite the same as, you know, getting to deal with contemporary technology. So I said, you know, this will be a lot of fun. And I ended up picking virtual reality and blockchain as the technologies to focus on because they got extensive coverage in the Tech Review. And also because I happen to think these are two technologies that have a lot of interesting implications for our lives going forward. And they happen to also cover a lot of ground in both tech and law, which are the two areas I have some expertise in and really enjoy writing about. So I said, okay, I'll combine these and try to write a story that would put all of these interests in there.
Yeah, what was striking for me in reading this story was how well you explained how more or less Bitcoin works. Especially the Byzantine generals problem. Like, I can't believe he managed to make this not boring. How is that possible?
Yeah, you know, it's frustrating to me to read mainstream coverage about stuff where the person does not, in fact, understand what they're talking about. You know this. I mean, like I think a lot of us have this experience where, you know, when you're a younger person, you read mainstream coverage of stuff and you're like, oh, you know, they really know what they're talking about. This is how I learn about the world. But later on, when you've acquired expertise in some subject area, be it, you know, biology or comp sci or, you know, Spanish grammar, let's say, and then you end up reading mainstream coverage about that area where you have expertise. You know, I'm sure a lot of biologists have the experience. They read coverage of, you know, biology discoveries, and they're like, oh my God, not a single thing in that paragraph is correct. Or, you know, if you're from a city and then you read something about your city and you're just like, okay, this is not somebody who knows anything about the city. It's just all wrong. And then once you experience that, you sort of come to the conclusion that, okay, wait a minute, you know, I happen to know a lot about this area, which is why I can tell this coverage is incorrect. But what about all the other areas in which I don't know anything about? How can I trust what they're saying about those? You know, how can I trust anything about what they're saying about comp sci, about politics, about anything? You end up realizing that you actually can't, and you have to actually go look at the primary sources and really try to understand it yourself. And, you know, being a techie, I've spent, you know, my entire life really being deeply engrossed in systems and trying to understand technical systems. And so I said, look, there's just so much bad explanation of how blockchain works and what Bitcoin is, and so much negative, ignorant portrayal of what cryptocurrency is and why people find the technology and the idea thrilling. I'm going to try to actually write a story for once where these ideas are going to be taken seriously. I'm not going to talk down to my audience, and I'm going to actually explain things to the best of my ability so that it's accurate and truthful. And the thing is, when you take that stance, the stories are actually much more interesting. You know, it's not like when you simplify it and when you do a story that elides over the most important technical concepts, that the story is somehow better. It's not. When you really get into the nitty gritty of it and explain the details of what the problem being solved is and why the solution is elegant and interesting, people are into that. We like that. So anyway.
Yeah, and it allows your brain to sort of make more connections on and make more analogies and understand it better. and people like the feeling of understanding. At least I do. I mean, but I gotta say though, like you're one of the few people that I know that enjoys reading like a lot of papers and like going to the original source. Like I've seen you, you know, read like a math paper for fun, or like read a law case for fun. So it's one of those things that I think you have a talent for. It's interesting that you're applying it to your writing and like taking all these original sources and putting it into a form that's actually really digestible. And if you read this story, guys, like there's some really good ways to explain a lot of things about consensus and who you're actually trusting in things, which I found absolutely invaluable. But let's talk about the story a little bit. I thought that, at least in my reading of it, social coordination was a really big theme, especially trust around like who to trust and how to trust. How much, like reading the story, it wasn't clear, but what's your view on how much of human decision making is rational and how much is emotional? Because I think at least in our industry, at least in Bitcoin, there's a lot of people that think it should be mostly rational, but there's clearly an emotional component which causes these like fluctuations and stuff. So just wanted to get your take on that with respect to
I don't have like a normative argument, really. I think descriptively you're right. I think the problem is a lot of times we sort of say that rational decision making is the best way to make decisions, but that we don't actually mean the same thing when we say rational. This is the problem with language and with words. You know, people can seem to be agreeing on something when in fact they're not. Rational. What does rational actually mean? Facts and the assumptions one makes to make these decisions often are not things we agree on at all, which is where principles and commitments come into place, and those are actually fundamentally emotional issues. I mean, let me get back to your original point a little bit, but here's a digression which I think actually is important. One of the so let me just give a quick summary of the story at a high level so people get what this is about. The story is about how do we actually practice humanitarian aid in a way that makes sense? How do we do this in a way that actually helps rather than harms? I know quite a bit about how large international aid agencies work. And the problem is a lot of times these international aid agencies and NGOs, they do more harm than good. Honestly, that's fundamentally what it is. The people who work for these have the best of intentions. The people who donate to these causes have the best of intentions. The problem is institutionally, you cannot helicopter in people who are not on the ground and who have a model in their heads of how the world ought to work and put them in a real situation and then have real people be subject to their decisions. It's sort of like having people who are remote operators of drones being involved in the situation when they're not there. The reason why you have to have somebody being there, right in there, it's this idea of skin in the game, right? And Nassim Taleb talks about it. It's this idea that you have to actually be faced with the downside of your decisions. Otherwise, you make decisions based on models and you give opinions for which you suffer no consequence, and then other people end up paying the price for your mistakes. And that tends to be a pervasive problem with our modern world, in which institutions have become the repository of authority, of trust. We are told to trust institutions, and institutions then end up making decisions for us, be it government with fiat currency or large NGOs. Right. All this. I mean, you place your trust in these institutions and think that somehow things will work out. So what I sort of wanted to talk about is the potential for blockchain to be a much more radical, disruptive force in this institutionalization of trust, and to see if it's possible to remove the intermediary of institutions and allow people to practice their empathy and their ability to give aid to strangers directly. Is it possible to conceive of a system in which this will work? Of course, it sounds ridiculous when you phrase it like that, but lots of ridiculous things have worked. Wikipedia is a ridiculous thing when it was first conceived, but it worked out. The idea of distributed trust, of not trusting any single central authority, of coming up with a way to make this work is, deeply interesting to us as human beings. We shouldn't think that, institutions and bureaucracies are the only way to solve these problems of coordination. There are other ways that we can do this. But back to the point you were making earlier, rationality and emotions. My view is that you should be rational in your decision making. You should, in fact, make sure that your reasons are reasons based on real facts, and that you have thought through the consequences, and that you do, in fact, use your frontal cortex to think through the costs and benefits of everything that you're trying to do, and that you're, in fact, helping rather than harming people. But here's the thing, though. I think fundamentally, why you do something, that has to be ultimately an emotional decision. So I'll give you an example, right? If let's say we're debating, I don't know, you're debating the matter of the institution of slavery. If your reason for opposing slavery is, I have done all this cost and benefit analysis, and I have come to the conclusion that slavery is bad economically, so we're not going to be doing that, I'm not going to trust that. I don't trust your decision at all. I don't trust you if that is your decision-making process. You should be making fundamental decisions about human dignity and things like that based on fundamental commitments to what it means to have to have human dignity and to be a good human person. These are emotional commitments, in fact. These are, you feel a natural revulsion to the idea of slavery. That is something that I trust. Fundamentally, the most important decisions when making our lives, like who do we marry, who do we fall in love with, what sort of work gives us joy, these are not rational decisions at all. These are decisions made based on fundamental emotional commitments. And there's nothing wrong with that. You have to accept that is, in fact, a very important part of being human. And in fact, perhaps the most highly valued part of being human. The reason why I call the story Byzantine empathy is because this kind of empathic ability, this commitment to fundamental principles is so important to us as human beings. And yet we seem in the modern world to be doing everything we can to use the language of rationalism rather than actual rationalism to divide ourselves from our empathy. We have emotional commitments to certain things being right, being important, and we're told to reason that empathy away. We're supposed to reason our way to thinking that it's okay to harm people. It's okay to invade certain countries and to just kill a lot of people because this serves some larger geopolitical goal. I am very, very opposed to that mode of thinking.
Yeah, I mean, I could listen to you all day. I mean, that was wow. I think there's a lot to unpack in what you just said. I like the little digression that you made there, because I could bring it back a little bit to Bitcoin, which is that top-down design of systems without the ground level reality. They just don't work. 90% of the time, it's a waste of money. And yet that's exactly what a lot of these ICOs try to do. They try to design an entire system without necessarily going through any trial and error. They just sort of do whatever they think might work. And of course, most of them haven't launched. A lot of them that have failed miserably. Yet a lot of people are still putting money into them. And I've always sort of asked myself why. And I think your point about how a lot of people have a natural tendency to almost put trust in institutions as a way to outsource some of their personal responsibility, that seems to hit the mark somehow, right?
I also think we've been taught to do that, right? I mean, we've been taught to trust what mainstream papers say about a topic. Like, the idea is if an economist says this, and the economist, has gotten awards, that means the economist knows what they're talking about. When we hear some person give an opinion on TV, we're told this person is an expert, expert, right? Got degrees from this institution and that one, and has published papers and written books. They are experts. So we're just told to trust this sort of thing. But like I said earlier, once you've actually learned about some topic in some depth and really acquired an expertise, and then you go look at the opinions given by mainstream institutions on these topics that you know something about, you realize they're wrong all the time. So the trust is just not justified. If they can't be trusted in giving opinions on something you know something about, why should you trust them to give opinions on matters that you're not really aware of? It feels like, the thing we ought to do is to not harm people rather than believe that top-down design models will just magically work, right? I mean, like you were saying, like it seems like we think these models will just magically work out in practice. But why? Well, I mean, it's never been tried before. There's no adjustment. What thing do you know of where the top-down first design is the thing that worked? I mean, nothing in life works like that.
Yeah, indeed. It's often a real struggle to find something that does work. And like many companies, startups especially, find that they can't find anything that works because they tried every which way. They tried designing it. They tried talking to people. But in the end, there just isn't a market for their product, which obviously we've gone through a number of times.
Yes, we did. And actually, it's almost good if all that happens is they waste some money and nothing is harmed. I'm much more, concerned about the instances where the top-down model affects real people's lives in a harmful way, which is often what happens in a lot of these contexts. People who are dependent on these institutions are constantly let down by them. And it's a thing that I worry a lot about.
Especially the Federal Reserve. Should we get into fiat money? I mean, because we've talked about this at least a little bit. I think I've been trying to convince you to buy Bitcoin for a long time, and I think you've heard my screeds against the central bank.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So by your argument, you seem to be pretty against the entire idea of managing the money supply of an ecomi.
I'm much more skeptical of it now than I used to be. I mean, again, if you study mainstream economics, there's reams of theories and models for why this is a good thing. But if you observe what happens in the real world and the number of times this has not worked out and catastrophic failures. Every time a catastrophic failure like that happens, notice the explanation is always, oh, it's an aberration. It's because of terrible people who were taking advantage of this system. The problem is there will always be terrible people and people taking advantage of the system. So if your model does not work under these conditions, maybe you need to rethink the model and perhaps abandon it. So yes, I'm much more skeptical of those arguments now than I used to be.
Yeah. All right. Let's switch gears a little bit. I've always been curious. You're obviously in the science fiction writing scene, and you know a lot of the other authors and stuff. Do a lot of them write code? Is that something that they do? Does writing words on paper translate well to?
That's interesting. I mean, I would say that because coding is something that so many people know and now pick up as just a relevant skill for whatever else they have to study. I mean, of the writers I know, I would say the majority of them know how to code or some way of coding. I don't know how true that is of the general population. But at least among the writers I know, I would say majority of them are at least familiar with some simple scripting, if not, much more, a lot more technical expertise. As far as whether there's some sort of correlation between writing fiction and writing code, I don't know. I mean, for me, I have always seen these activities as related in some way. When you're writing code, a lot of the aesthetic considerations to me are very similar to writing fiction. You care a lot about elegance, about the idea of balance, about making sense, this idea of explaining some concept once in a subroutine so that you can call on it and not have to repeat over and over again, an idea of building up things so that, you know, when you call them back in your main, they all just block, 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 make sense, and everything works. The idea of building a machine that achieves a certain effect in an elegant way is actually very similar to the kind of consideration you have as a fiction writer to guide the reader down an emotional path in a very elegant way and allows them to achieve a certain result. I don't know. I tend to think maybe that's a metaphor that works well for me. I don't know how well it works in general for other writers. Maybe other writers find this whole idea of constructing fiction much like a program very offensive and in fact annoying and just terribly unimaginative. But for me, it helps a lot to think of all these activities as related to building virtual machines of some sort.
Yeah, I mean, it's a virtual machine that runs in a human brain instead of maybe in code or something.
Exactly. I mean, being a lawyer is very similar too, because you're writing a contract, which essentially is a virtual machine that gets interpreted by the legal system to achieve a certain result. Actually, that's the thing that actually is mentioned in the story. So yeah.
Yeah, and it seems like you found the commonality among all of the careers that you've had, just kind of hacking one thing or another in a particular way.
That's right.
That's really cool. So one thing I've noticed about a lot of science fiction is that a lot of it, at least like the ones that I've read, and by no means like that well read in science fiction, don't seem to be incorporating the idea of cryptocurrencies very much. And yours is actually one of the first stories where I was like, okay, that actually incorporates it. Is that a fair statement?
You know, I'm not sure. I mean, there are just so many people writing science fiction, and the market is so large. It's really hard to make any generalizations. I mean, I do know a few people who have really looked into cryptocurrency and are really deeply interested in it and have written fiction using the concepts here and there. So I wouldn't say that it's not a topic that people are thinking about. I think in some ways, because the topic is still relatively quote unquote new, that there's actually a lot of hype in the mainstream reporting, that actually makes it very hard to write good fiction about it. Because on the one hand, you know, when you're a writer, you can't ignore the audience entirely. So if the audience is expecting you to talk about cryptocurrency a certain way because of the sensationalistic coverage, and you're trying to write in a different direction, that's actually really hard. I mean, that's one of the things I found hard about the story, which is that so much of what's being said about blockchain and smart contracts and VR is just so over the top and ridiculous that trying to write a story that treats these ideas sympathetically and realistically is actually very difficult. So I think that may be the part of the reason why you're not seeing as much of it as you like. But I know people are looking into it. People are really into it, interested in it.
That makes sense. And, you know, like, I guess this gets into more generally about how writers need to take the future into account and like sort of building a world around that. And this is something that I've seen in your stories, is that you have a lot of just, you know, random useful stuff that you expect to improve instead of like these like, you know, giant time travel machines or something like that. Instead, it's just like, you know, a little thing in the Tupperware that keeps the humidity a certain way or something like that, right? Like stuff that's actually practical. And, you know, how much of that, like, do you need to study to get to that? Because I feel like you'd have to constantly read about possible tech that's coming up and like treat that stuff more reasonably.
You know, I think it depends on what sort of sci-fi you want to write. I mean, you know, a lot of, I mean, some writers I know are, you know, futurologists. They really believe this idea of futurism and that it's possible to predict the future by extrapolating from trends. I'm in general skeptical of that approach. I found that science fiction has actually not been that great at predicting the future. And if you really want to, you know, make some argument that the future has been predicted in science fiction, you end up making these very strained examples where you just have to stretch things a lot. You know, arguing that somehow either science fiction inspired people to go down a certain route or that it's really just a flat out prediction. But if you look into it, which is my tendency, I enjoy looking into facts, and turns out to be not the case. I mean, one popular example that's often cited as sci-fi predicting the future or influencing the future in some way is this idea that Star Trek's communicator inspired the design of cell phones. And this was actually repeated in a documentary. It turns out that, when you actually look into it, the actual inventor at Motorola explained that, no, that's actually not true. The story got spread around because, the film crew for William Shatner Changed the World, which is, the documentary, the crew sort of, posited the story to the inventor, and the inventor was so starstruck at the time that he sort of allowed the crew to run with that story, even though it's not true. So I mean, I like digging.
Same trust problem that we're talking about from the story, right?
That's the thing. That's the thing, right? I mean, like, that story gets repeated all the time. You search online and you find tons of references to it, but it's not true. It's not true. So if you know something about how this works and you dig into it, you find out that it's like all these stories about science fiction predicting the future, it just doesn't really bear up under scrutiny. So I'm not a big believer in predicting the future. What I tend to enjoy is to just extrapolate and talk about potential possibilities, and get people to think about something that they might not have thought about before. That's all. Sometimes I think science fiction can be kind of fun and interesting in that it gives people a vocabulary to talk about something. It's sort of like cyberpunk really didn't predict anything, but it gave us a bunch of words that we get to use, like cyberspace and meat space and avatar and all this stuff. We end up being able to use these words to talk about concepts that are really not the same at all as their original, fictional incarnations, but these words are inspiring, and they help us think about these problems. So I think that can be really useful and helpful. And hopefully, if I do something like, having a vocabulary so that we can reason about certain concepts is actually quite useful.
Yeah. So one quibble I have with a lot of science fiction is that they don't seem to spend a lot of time on the economic reality of like certain world building, and that's been annoying for me for a long time, right? Like, a lot of stories, they'll just get into something and then it's like, well, how do they pay each other, or how does anyone make money, or whatever?
How are people incentivized to do anything?
Yeah, and like, especially like the utopian world, it doesn't make any sense, like why anyone would do anything. And but that's at the fundamental reality of almost everybody in existence. So it's a little bit frustrating to not see a lot of that in there. Are there any stories or fiction that you would recommend for people like me that are frustrated with that particular aspect?
I think it's hard to overcome that frustration, partly because the way we understand economics is so different, individuals. I mean, like, so many of us have been taught the economy is, a set of models that we learn from economics textbooks. And as we all know, the models do not describe reality, but when you're writing fiction, you can't quite escape from these models. And so you end up making suppositions that seem to make sense under some model, but don't necessarily actually make any sense. But I will say that quite a bit of recent science fiction has really gone into exploring specifics of how you make models make economic futures and even dystopian or utopian futures somewhat reasonable in terms of the economics of it. Like Malka Older has a series of books about the future. Oh my God! Now the name is blanking. Her series is the name of her series is blanking on me for the moment. If I think about it, I'll come back and mention it. But yeah, Malka Older, she has done some really interesting things about imagining the future of micro democracies and how the economic and political systems would function under such a system. And she takes it actually very far beyond that point. But it really is quite interesting.
Yeah, I can't imagine. Something that one of my Twitter followers wanted me to ask you is, what do you think about Bitmain? Because they seem to be really big fans of the three-body problem, and in fact, they created this AI ASIC that they're calling the Sophon, which is from the book. I believe you're the one that translated that first. So I don't know what it is in Chinese. Maybe it sounds similar, but that's what they're
Close enough, yeah. So I have to say the name Sophon actually wasn't my invention. I think Joe Martinson, who translated the second book, was the one who came up with the idea for it. Or maybe Sophon had been used once before in some source. I can't remember, but I'm pretty sure Joel was the one who came up with it. I will say that, you know, the whole thing about the three-body problem and the tech community has been really fun to watch. So one thing that, you know, you may not know is the three-body problem became really popular in China in part because it was very much promoted and read by folks working the tech industry in China, and they loved the series. They loved the series, you know, because of the technical stuff and all the big ideas, but they also sort of loved it because they saw the dark forest hypothesis and the way alien species would try to eradicate potential competitors as a kind of metaphor for the tech industry as a whole. Because in China, the tech industry is super competitive. I mean, it is in Silicon Valley too, but you know, in China, in some ways, it's even more cutthroat. So companies would compete with each other using all kinds of tactics that make Uber, you know, seem like, you know,
it's like a very fair person,
right? Like a very fair player. So they would resort to some really terrible tactics, and so a lot of the ideas in the three-body problem, the series, became mapped to these tactics. So you know, there's one part of the last book where one potential kind of attack is to reduce a three-dimensional space to a two-dimensional space, this dimension reduction attack. And that's being seen as a metaphor for how a lot of tech companies compete with each other, meaning they drag their competitors down to a lower level, to a lower dimension, forcing them to compete in a much more crude and deadly realm. That instead of rising up, you know, instead of picking everyone up, it's about dragging everything down to the lowest common denominator. So, you know, it's kind of interesting to see how
that's really interesting because I mean, there's a story that David Vorik wrote. Well, I think it was a Medium post, but he's been trying to figure out ways to compete with Bitmain, for example. Bitmain being sort of the 900-pound gorilla in the Bitcoin mining space right now, because they produce something like 60 to 70% of all mining manufacturing equipment. But one of the things that he pointed out is that they play a certain way, right? Like in a way that he didn't expect, and in the sense that they, you know, they're talking to some suppliers about getting some heat sinks for their miner or something like that, and then all of a sudden, just radio silence. Like, what's going on? And you know, like, part of, he doesn't know that it's Bitmain or whatever, but enough things like that seem to happen to everybody that tries to get into this industry that it's suspected that that's kind of how they play. And you know, if you look at the history of mining manufacturing and stuff, there were a lot of bad players for sure. But you know, they kind of got, you know, what happened there. Like, was some of this involved? Were a lot of these Chinese business practices that you're talking about, which maybe the Western world isn't completely familiar with, maybe that affected them? Like, what's your thought on that?
I don't know. I mean, I don't know enough details to give opinions. You know, I try to avoid giving opinions on something where I don't know anything about, because, you know, that I know that's a problem that I see in a lot of people. So I don't know. If I were working in the industry and knew more of the details, I'd probably be able to give an informed answer. But no, I don't.
But it is interesting, though, that's the metaphor for the entire tech community in China, because obviously that's where Bitmain is based. And a lot of the people that are coming out of China, that have gone through a lot of this, I imagine would be able to talk more about it. But
yeah, I would imagine so. I mean, it was really interesting to me to talk to some of the folks in the Chinese tech community and to sort of hear their opinions of the book and why they liked it. They just sort of described how the way the dark forest hypothesis works and the way these aliens just use all sorts of horrible tactics to bring their potential competitors down. They're like, oh, this is my daily life. This is what it's like. I wish things weren't like this, but this is how it is. It's just there are so many companies in the space and they want to win. And it's just like the most cutthroat environment. So, it's interesting how fiction resonates with people in a way that you completely don't anticipate. I mean, I talked to Liu Cixin, the author, about it, and the author was like, I had no idea that this would be the case. I certainly wasn't writing the novel as some sort of metaphor for that, but that's what they took it to be.
Wow, that's so interesting. Maybe he was doing it unconsciously. I'm not sure. It's always I guess that's one of the things that you kind of have to suffer through as an author. People find meaning in things that you didn't intend, and that's
sometimes that's cool. If it brings people joy to view the metaphor that way, that's awesome. If not, that's great too.
Yeah, it certainly that. There's definitely a need in the Bitcoin community to figure out how to work with the Eastern Hemisphere, right? Like there's, and this is something that a lot of people talk about a lot is how do we work together, right? Because there's it's a worldwide thing, and there's a large contingent in China, for example, and certainly.
I feel like the question here really ought to be. It is the distrust of institutions or of individuals. I mean, here's my thing. My thing has always been, it's really, really bad, in my view, to resort to abstractions of any sort in your analysis. For the same reason that, if you try to treat any local conflict as some sort of reflection of global geopolitics, you're going to end up going into this bureaucratic mindset where every single local conflict must be globalized immediately and seen as some sort of life or death struggle between two great global powers. And then, what ends up happening is the actual people involved are the ones who suffer the harm of your armchair analysts. So I like to avoid abstractions as much as possible. So in a situation like this, I think it's best, if possible, to avoid explanations based on so-called culture or nationality or grand abstractions of that sort, because there is actually no such thing as a Chinese culture, no more than there is such a thing as American culture. You ask 100 people, to define what does it mean to be American, you're going to get 100 different answers. And that's good, that there's some strength to the fact that we can define things in this very local, specific, personal way. In terms of the problem that's being encountered here, I don't know if the problem is so much with how do you work with the whole Eastern Hemisphere, so much as, is there some way for us to understand what is actually happening there? Is there some sort of concentration of power happening behind the scenes that we don't understand? Is there some kind of thwarting of individual decision making and sort of the ideal of this model in which the reason why there is the reason you can trust is because of the actual work it takes on each individual node, is that process being undermined and thwarted by something very local and specific. If we can try to avoid explaining things by resorting to big abstract, grand abstractions and focus on local specific things, I think we're going to be much happier, and we're going to be able to solve a lot more problems and not be so anxious.
Indeed, and it's been speculated, hey, maybe the Chinese government is involved here because they're getting really low electricity rates or whatever. Yeah, but nobody really knows, and doesn't help that there isn't that much communication going back and forth, and there's a lot of distrust on both sides.
That's
probably
the
based
issue.
on an abstraction, like you said.
Yeah, that's the thing. I feel like if we can somehow get through this kind of barriers of communication because of this distrust and abstractions, and try to reach to individuals and actually work with concrete, local, specific people, it's going to be everything is a lot easier if we can get to that point.
Yeah, it would be. Yeah, so I have one more thing that I wanted to run by you. I have this idea for a story, and it's a Satoshi Nakamoto origin story. And I want it to be kind of a sci-fi story. And the basic idea is Satoshi Nakamoto is actually a robot from the future.
Of course.
That's got a very limited time traveling ability. Basically, can flip bits on a computer, but that's it, right? Like very limited. So of course, what does Satoshi do? Creates Bitcoin. And why would a robot from the future try to do that? To save us from monetary collapse, which inevitably leads to some sort of war.
I love it. This is like the Terminator, but in a utopian version.
Well, a good computer.
Yeah, exactly. A
utopian version. So anyway, I'm not even sure like what category this would be in or whatever, but that's and I have a lot of ideas that I don't execute.
You should work on this idea after you finish your current book.
Yeah, which is my editors literally wrote me yesterday. They're like, we're really far behind. We should be in the middle of tech review right now, and you should have written at least half the chapters in full. I'm like, I'm really sorry. Yeah, I'm gonna have to meet with them Friday. But speaking of which, how do you make sure you get all your writing done? Like, what's your secret, man?
I don't have a secret. I have a lot of issues getting that done too. I mean, it's a real problem, because I get immersed in this world. I'm trying to get it done. It's not like I don't want to get it done, but as you surely know now that you've tried to write a book, sometimes you would rather do anything other than sitting in front of the computer to write that book. So you find ways to be productive in other ways, but ultimately you're just procrastinating. I can't tell you that I actually have a magic solution for that. I end up doing the same. I mean, I guess my answer would be yes. Sometimes it is important to force yourself to actually do these things, but honestly, the more important thing is to do the thing that excites you at that moment. I really think that if you try to do the thing that excites you at that moment, you will end up all right. Because, it's just like, you got to let yourself, let that emotion guide you. You can't always do the so-called rational thing when certain things are not really subject to rational analysis. Why are you excited by one kind of work? Why are you passionate about one kind of work more than another? It feels like God and the universe and your body and your mind are all trying to tell you something. You cannot be other than as your nature dictates. And it's best to try to pursue work that fits your nature.
Yeah, I mean, that sounds like a great argument for somebody that's living with a YOLO mentality. It's always you got to balance it somehow, right? Like, because like if you just
I don't disagree. I mean, you got to do certain things that are not pleasant. I mean, I guess when I say excitement, it's like this is back to the issue of what does that mean? I don't mean excitement in the I want a marshmallow now, that kind of excitement. I mean excitement like this is work I really want to do because I feel like this is something that really fulfills me and it makes me, this is something I'm uniquely suited for and I'm really good at it. You got to do that.
Yeah, and I feel like a lot of that is sort of like educated out of us, like how to make some of those kinds of decisions. Because I don't know about you, but when I was just like working for a company or whatever, you didn't have to make any of those decisions. Somebody just kind of told you what you needed to work on, and you just worked on them. But once you have your own freedom, it's almost like, oh man, I have to make that decision, and that's almost kind of a burden in a way.
Yeah. Well, it's the burden of freedom, right? It's the burden of actually making your own choices. I mean, I think you're right. A lot of that kind of excitement and sort of belief in excitement is educated out of us, because I feel like, you know, our schools tend to present this vision of work as, you know, how to be a good corporate drone. You know, how do you put your own interests aside for the interests of the larger institution? How do you maximally make yourself as much like a machine as possible, so that you devote your time to your employer's interests, and that you can advance up the ladder by following the script? I feel like we're told that that's the responsible thing to do and the good thing to do, when in fact that's presented as the rational thing to do. You know, here again, I feel like if you really believe in that kind of rationality, you are giving your emotional core, you're doing it a deep disservice. As a human being, you really cannot live like that, at least not in a way that's fulfilling.
Yeah, and figuring that out, right? Like what it is, it's not really something that you can learn in school, right? Like
no, yeah.
It's kind of sad, because it's seen as the right or rational way, like you said, and it's not really. There's a deeper reality that we're not really tapping into here.
Yep.
All right. Well, anyway, it's been about almost an hour. I can't believe.
Oh yeah! Wow, it has been. Okay.
Yeah. So anyway, I want to thank you for being on the show. What are you working on now? What are you writing? What sort of things can your fans be looking forward to?
So I'm working on a couple of short stories right now that should come out later in the year, and they're going to have something to do with smart contracts and potentially blockchain as well. So that should be fun. But really, the bulk of my time right now is devoted to finishing the last book in my epic fantasy series. So the series is called The Dandelion Dynasty, and the first two books are The Grace of Kings and The Wall of Storms. And the book I'm working on doesn't have a title yet. It's the third book, and it's going to end up the trilogy. It is a lot of fun, you know. Like I mentioned earlier, it's epic fantasy, but there's actually a lot of engineering involved, and so I'm just having a lot of.
I think is what you've created a whole new category.
That's right. So I'm having a lot of fun creating machines and fantasy machines based on classical East Asian engineering principles. And this one is a lot of fun because you know, I actually have to construct some models to make sure some of these machines will somewhat function as I say they will. So I've had to build some electrostatic machines to make them to do the sort of thing I want them to do.
Interesting. Wow, you're really like getting into that, huh?
It's a lot of fun. It's a lot of fun.
Okay. Well, I mean, I thank you so much for being on the show. Ken's story is called Byzantine Empathy, and unfortunately, you can't purchase it for the Kindle, which I'm kind of annoyed at. But you can't get the hardcover off of Amazon. I put a link in the show notes. You know, it's not just your story. There's a bunch of other really good stories, including like a graphic novel, right? Like I didn't expect that.
Which is a lot of fun. And I definitely recommend Elizabeth Thair's story in there too. Really a lot of fun.
And Liu Cixin, he's the one that wrote The Three-Body Problem, which
that's right.
You translated. That's
right. If you're a fan of Liu Cixin, you'll see a story from him in there too. I mean, it's a great collection of authors. So if you're into sci-fi at all, you know, take a look, check it out.
All right. Well, thank you so much for being on, and you know, maybe we can do this again when you write your next story, or I don't know, maybe we'll do it whenever we feel like it, I guess.
Totally. Thank you, Jimmy. Thank you very much for having me on the show.
Yeah, and thank you guys for joining us. I think we got up to like 75 or 80 live viewers at one point. Anyway, thank you, and this song is done.